Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the last lecture of the last Lubalin lecture of the summer. I want to first thank Hoefler&Co for their support of this lecture series of the archive and getting this live to you on YouTube and the Zoom webinar. And then I'd like to introduce the speaker today. So Petr van Blokland graduated cum laude from Graphic Arts program at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in The Hague. With his partner Claudia Mens, Van Blokland worked since 1980 as a designer in the studio they co-founded. His output ranges from sketching and model making to programming in various languages. He specializes in systemic design with an emphasis on typography, type, and corporate design. He's taught many years at the Academy of Fine Arts at Arnhem, TypeMedia at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in The Hague, and at Master Graphic Design at St. Bruce in Breda. He is co-founder of WebType and Type Network. His oldest typeface is Proforma and Productus, originally released by Font Bureau, are now published by TYPETR at Type Network. Recent typefaces include Bitcount and Upgrade. His work brought him ATypI's coveted Charles Peignot Prize in 1988. New initiatives focus on design and production of typefaces, exploring the possibilities and limitations of variable fonts and the use of programming in the process of graphic design and typography. Recently, together with Claudia Mens, Design Space was founded, offering an online environment for design workshops and studies. And now please welcome Petr van Blokland.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, Cara, and for the opportunity to speak at the Lubalin lecture series, second time in a different setting. But nevertheless, I hope still as joyful and informing. I prepared a lecture, and we will be talking about design, and I always like to have that as an overall view. So we're not particularly talking about logo design, corporate design, or type design in particular. There's always a reference to teaching. I think being a designer and a teacher there's very much overlap to that. And as teachers educating design, it is I think a responsibility for the teachers to make sure that design students can still do their work 20, 30, 40 years from now. And we have no idea what that future will be. So that's kind of an unsolvable problem. And in my experience, that the closest there is to focus on the process, the things that probably don't change. So one of the things in this lecture is the aspect of design that is, in my view, my experience, not going to change pretty soon. The materials change, technology change, but the process itself has been there forever, and I think will be forever. Part of that whole discussion, what is design anyway, is that there's so much to definition. What do words means? If you watch my previous Lubalin lecture, that was titled Words, that was entirely about the definition of stuff. This focused more on two specific words, and one of them is what is design? And you can argue there's as many design definitions as there are designers, probably more. But for the sake of this presentation, this is what I would like to stick to. So a very wide range of and much more focused on the process than it is on the outcome. And this has always been a very workable definition when talking with students. You do something, and then if you didn't do it, it wasn't there. But if you do it, it is. And if you do it again, it gets better, or it might get better. And if it doesn't, then you go in another direction. There's another definition, which is the most important one in this lecture. We'll be looking at sketching a lot. And in that sense, a sketch is anything that you can afford to throw away and to start from scratch. So if you're in 3 weeks of InDesign work and there's so much work in it that you cannot afford to throw it away and do it again, then that's no longer called sketching. We're in production mode, trying to finish stuff. And one design project can have a very short sketching phase and a very long end of production, or the other way around. But as long as you can say, I'm trying this and I can do it again, if it doesn't work out very well, then for the sake of the definition in this lecture, that is sketching. So it's not about the tools. It's not about a pencil and paper in your sketchbook. Although we will see a lot of sketchbooks, scans, photos here. The sketch is something that is more part of the process than it is saying something about the material. You also see digital sketches in fitting this definition. So this is about sketching, and then the chapters are more or less separated into different topics. Of course, there's a lot of overlap, but also, again, for the sake of this presentation, I made some divisions. It's also a lot of time travel that was making this lecture, looking back into the history of the studio. Claudia and I started our studio in 1980, so this is more or less our 40th year of being designers, running a design studio, and we didn't do that alone. So over the years, we had over 25 people joining the studio longer and shorter periods of time, because that's another thing. This is not a personal achievement. You can only do this together, and using each other's skills and focus and level of interest, and bringing that together. So anything we do, anything you see in this lecture, is something that we made. It's not particularly that I did that. Even type, there's people helping, and there's a lot of sketches and a lot of illustrations that are made over the years. Another thing that made become visible is how sketching process changed over the years. So you'll see a lot of hand drawings, and we still do that a lot, although it's more in sketchbooks. But very early in the stage of the studio, we decided to standardize the sketching material, A3 tracing paper, the thickest quality you can get. And many of these things, many of the sketches are really old. They're like 20 or 30 years old, and they're still there. They're like nothing changed. Investing in good material, if it's physical, is good. And the other funny thing is that those sketches that we now photographed are in much better shape than the digital files over that whole period, because we can't read them anymore. I don't have hardware that runs PageMaker or Quark to read those files. So I'll get you through some real assignments that we did, picking ones that are relatively old. One identity is 16 years old, the other is 22 years old, and they're still there. They're still more or less there. They're still alive, and which is also fun to see. That it's not true for every identity we did over the years, but these two are still there. So this is the current website. As we started, it was called Reuma Fonds, which is the foundation to get money for rheumatology research and also for patient groups. And so that started with the name. So I'll get you through the process. It is a selection in that sense. Making a presentation like this is also a design process. Kill your darlings. So the first version of the presentation was 3 times longer than this one is, and then you have to get rid of things that don't really matter, and then more and more and more, and you end up with something that is really dense and I hope interesting enough to sit through for an hour. So one of the investigations is starting on logo, and I keep saying logo for again in this presentation. We normally try to change that into designing an identity, because you may not know if it will become a logo at the end. There are a lot of other ways to make recognition. People remember the name, which is nowadays called branding. A logo is a tool that's often used, but it's not necessarily the only tool. But since this is a little bit focused on type design, and we also focus more on the logo part of the identity than the whole visual grammar. So often the customer comes with the name, and that's one of the starting points. What is the name? What does it do? And it's one of the opportunities to make something unique, because the name by definition is unique, especially if it's a domain name. So letter combinations, what is in it? Over the years, we developed some models, and there are models from others that we use. And one of them is Jacques Bertin. You can look him up. He's not necessarily a typographer, graphic designer. He's more a cartographer. But he used he made theory behind making graphs, and that became his 7 parameters of how to visualize different kind of information. It's a bit focused, so you don't see type or typeface in this 7. So for other usage, they may need some additions or transformations, but it's a good starting point. So these are the 7 parameters you can change, and if you keep the rest the same, you automatically get into a range of shapes that have a difference, and they belong together. So that's particularly one thing you want to use in making graphs, but it's very useful in other ways too. So looking at parts of the word or particular letters, do you change the position of the letter, do you change the angle of the letter, or you change both? Is a way to, instead of randomly trying to modify parts of the word to make it unique. Those are ways of getting more structured way of a process in what part of the word, what part of the type are we going to change first. And you'll see later on that this is very close to, for instance, how type design works, where you have to make 2 different styles within the same family. What is the things that you're going to change? And if you change the angle parameter of Jacques Bertin, you end up with an italic. So it's a useful tool. It is a tool. It's not guaranteed success. It's also not complete, but it helps. And one of the things is not looking at the type itself, but looking at it by shapes. That means that and that immediately shows the difference what you do if you draw this or you type it in Illustrator. Typing the word in Illustrator and then cutting something off, that is a very usual way of designing logos. But if you draw it, you see it in every stage. You can draw, you can fill in the space in between, or you can fill in half of the letter, you can leave out half the letter, or combine 2 letters over each other. Drawing in transparent paper like this, you have the previous version on top of it, and it gives a history of drawings instead of changing something in Illustrator and then saving it, which tends to be very much more a sequential process than a parallel process as it is here. If you change that to type, there's a lot more. So this is more like a diverted way of translating the 7 parameters into Jacques Bertin into more specific parameters of type. Where Bertin just says shape. If you translate it into type design, you can recognize the difference between capitals, Roman, and italic, and between the outlines and the counters and accents, and so there's all bunch more of subtle different parameters that can be used. So playing with the word, and it's almost a mantra. If you don't know what to do anymore, just draw it again, because something else will happen, and then do it over and over and over again. And that gives a pile of transparent papers. In the studio that always worked, we have a table and there's a stack of current projects, which means that there's just this pile of transparent drawings that people work on. And you can grab them, combine them, put them back. That also automatically makes this into something that we do. We had this idea. You can't say that this idea was mine and not yours. It's a collective making of people who have all kind of contributions. Even looking at it sometimes by coincidence, upside down or reversed, or having by coincidence 2 different versions on top of each other that give you new ideas. Those things tend to be more happening if it's a physical appearance. Although I'm totally into coding and programming, and there is this part of the process where it delivers more ideas if you do it on in a physical way. So we have around 4 meters of bookshelf over these 40 years, where projects ended up in physical sketches like this, and then at some point got digitized and transformed into new media. Other questions: how much of the original logo should be there? Probably not, but that's always an idea that the customer brings to you if they don't want to suddenly change their whole identity. So you see all kind of variations, and it already is a bit of a design space. Are you going to change the weight? Are you going to change the width? You switch part of the letters from capitals to Roman? Do you cut them half away or partly drawing the reverse? Or you can pick out one letter. In this case, rheumatology is a large disease, so to say. There are many shapes, many forms, but they all have in common that they start with an R, and there's no other big disease that is starting with an R. So using the R as some kind of recognition is something to consider. And you see different handwritings, different people working here on this at the same time, and then you never know where to end. You never know if it's possible to catch the enormous meaning of the topic, or you end up with something that is very close to a competitor or to something that people already know, which has a totally different meaning. So besides the exercises in making a nice word and something that can be recognized and can be shown in small sizes, and all this endless list of requirements of a word and typeface. There's also, in this case, it should have a meaning. Is it not contradicting at least what it's supposed to say? In Dutch there is plaatje praatje, that's often seen as an approach. You take an arbitrary shape and you put next to it an arbitrary name and then call that a logo. We always try to to get away from that, that if you leave out one of the two, then you have less than half. So what's the relation between the two? That makes, and you can do that by putting the letter into an environment, or see how those what the interacting shape between such an image and the word is, or redefine the word, or and then there's this this extended usage where an ad agency wants to add a payoff. So is the logo capable of doing that? Is it already part of it? Is it a system where the payoff can change over the years, where the logo itself remains the same level of visibility? And in this case, the assignment was pretty complex, because there's a whole set of associations that are supported by the organization that traditionally have their own identity, but they should visually be part of it, but they have all kind of different names. So how can you make something? So in this case, the R, and you see the more or less, it's a moving R, italic, and that by itself was strong enough to make logo combinations more like a system. So you can add in every kind of word here, and it will still fit. The typeface in this case was profiled by Martin Wenzel, and moving to another. So this is an older one, 22 years, still in use. Dutch Republic is a software company. An even longer name than the Remmer Fonds, Remmer Nederland. And there is this little twitch in it, which has the name in itself, because Holland, Netherlands are not a republic; they're a kingdom. So that's the more or less the joke in here. That's already. So you're going to emphasize that, or is it something to ignore, or to? So the same thing, and it even starts out with no particular typeface. So what is it if you take a marker and you write the word over and over and over again? What happens? And they're hidden surprises sometimes, and not always. And you can go on, and at some point say, well, this is how far we can get. Some words are harder to make logos for than others, but the same here. So what can you vary? Sketches are also documentation. If you do this in design, there's a lot of intermediate versions that never could be seen. So then customer may have ideas that you already rejected, but it wasn't documented. So sketching takes more time, but at the end it creates a whole set of documentation that can be reused even years later, as an example in other identity presentations. About the sketching process itself, this is a sheet from my time at the academy, which was 75 to 80, where we got these sheets. The only way of making type was going to the print shop and do letterpress for whatever was available. And the other side was, well, then sketch it. And type specimens were hard to get. They're really expensive. But there were manufacturers like Monotype in this case, who brought out these sheets for designers, where you see the sizes on the side. And there were no scanners, there were no computers. You couldn't have a photocopy machine, and then tracing paper. That was it. It's easier now. So even it's likely that an identity has not enough time to make a new typeface. So in practice, it means that you're doing a refit or a change of an existing typeface. So print the word in all the typefaces you can find in your computer lowercase n capitals, and then see what happens there. So they give a good tracing background to make drawings. I always say that it is not championship freestyle type drawing in this case. It's not intended to be a new type design. It is to see what happens, maybe even with existing typefaces, because you always have to fit something with text, fitting it with an existing type. So even if you make something else, at least it should work together. The Dutch public, is it something to be used or not? So those things happen if you draw them, much more likely than typing them. But it costs time. It is the mantra of going through drawings. You cannot speed it up. It looks like you type this in different typefaces and print it, and then cut bits and pieces here, then you made a logo. That's not the kind of assignment we were seeking. There should be some time in finding, getting to know what happens there. And again, I said it before, drawing the white space often is a way of finding unique combinations, because they are part of the name, instead of just looking at the letters. Although type may be black and white, it is you're drawing the white space with your black shapes, and maybe the white space, maybe the counters in designing typeface are more important than the type itself. So any combinations, even if it gets unreadable, it may be a start point for someone else to get another idea that you never thought of. There's also vertical alignments that may be desirable or not. Sometimes it works nice. Sometimes it makes it really unreadable. Especially in names that are abbreviations with an arbitrary order of capitals, damaging the type also will reduce the recognition of the word, because there's no redundancy. If if a word like this, you can damage it more than if the logo is just ABC or so. And then there's counters in letters. So that ended up with the result here, where the counter of the R is also the D, and you can still look if the other way around also works, because the counter of the D is not an R, but maybe that's also something. In this case, that was the starting point to make the final logo. But once you're there is still the choice. Okay, and then how precisely? There's still many ways of doing it. So that's often what we call the second phase. You more or less know how to do it, but then still exactly how to do it and make the final drawings, that may be as much time. It's comparable to drawing the type and then spend as much time on the spacing as you did on the drawing. That also works in making the stationery and the visual language of other publications that are not necessarily contain the logo or have a reference. So what is it that you can borrow from that visual grammar that is in use in development, and then use it in other areas, so that becomes part of the recognition, even if they don't contain the full logo. This is all really old-fashioned, like 10, 20 years ago. This was really an issue, making stationery where the letterhead and the envelopes and the business card and the compliment cards all fit together, and they were printed, and they had all kind of requirements how that did in postal usage. Things changed, and so if you say 20 years ago, I'm a graphic designer, so I make stationery, you're in trouble, because then with no stationery, you're not a graphic designer anymore. if you say I make publications, and in the technology and the style of the format of the publications at that period in time, then you'll never run out of work. It's partly definition, it's also a mindset. But this was all stationary still at that time. You see the white is using the gray of the tracing paper. So if you put white at the back, it stands out. And also in this case, those white papers were printed, so you can some kind of standard layout. You don't have to sketch the lines of text. It's not a championship line drawing. So once you can use the computer to make things faster or repeating stuff, why not do it? It's also not that the case that you do first sketch and then on day X on Wednesday night, the sketching phase ends and then the computer phase starts. That's often questions I get from students. When's the sketching stop? So, well, actually never, and especially not in the definition that you can throw everything away and start over. That's the sketching phase. And that includes hand drawing, and it includes computers back and forth all the time. You can do some in InDesign and then decide that there's some things you want to work out, and then start sketching on paper again. That whole process is sketching. It's not something to do with the materials. All right. You see some other lucky coincidence that happens, that they are actually in this shape, resembles the map of Holland. It's some kind of, sometimes you get a present, and that if you present it to the customer, it looks like you have been working along this route all the time, but at some point it was just a lucky finding. This one is more recent. A friend of mine is directing directing the creative industries in Netherlands institution. So he had this idea of diversity, which was connected to this kind of sketches. Those sketches are easy to make because you start an idea of what this could become a whole new typeface, but just with one letter. The problems start if you need to make the second letter that fits the first one. So although this looks very diverse, and it's kind of avoiding the difficult part of type design to make things the same. But it gives an overview of all the dimensions and all the diversity, which is very close to my brother Eric's type cooker. He made that for TypeMedia at first, but it's a good training tool for type designers because it gives a recipe of making type that fits that doesn't fit the comfort zone. You have to go out and solve this recipe. You may never draw it yourself, but make a typeface that fits this. So all the letters on the right fit different. Besides that, there are figures, which is the construction requirement in the type cooker. Each of them probably needs a different recipe to describe them, but you get very close to those parameters of that I was talking about first. So that ended in a typeface with only 3 letters, but then with many versions, and then that's a very different way of designing type, because now you're doing the kerning of different typefaces, which almost never happens except in logos or so. And then there is this JavaScript that creates a random version every second to emphasize the diversity of what the organization is doing. In a more formal way, that leads to variable spaces. So as you can see, that thinking in parameters of different type has been as old as type design and as typography exists. It's just that now making variable fonts, it has become part of the file format, which opens up a lot of possibilities. It also adds restrictions because you cannot do anything you like. It has to fit in the routine that the glyphs should interpolate, which is not always what you would like from a designer point of view. So you have to make a lot of workarounds. This chapter is about sketches in how to think in n-dimensional spaces. How can you use the axes of variable fonts to hide certain features in type? How can you misuse the original format into making it work for your design? One way of doing that is making 10-dimensional spaces more simple, and put them in 3 dimensions, and then have those cubes in a row and call that a catalog axis. It's easier to, it helps making a variable font getting done within a lifetime if you incorporate that in the design process. So there's a lot of sketches how to make a multi-dimensional space which is over 3 dimensions into something that is at least something you can discuss about, and how can you test it, and how can you make sure that the space, that the whole space is more or less okay, that there aren't areas in a design space that then you tell people don't go there because it doesn't look good. In my view, it's responsibility to the designer to make sure that whatever you do with a product, if it's an industrial product or a type, should not be dangerous. You can't say you should only use this car in this situation because otherwise it will kill you. That probably will never get on the road. So these are sketches in how to make those design spaces visual. You talk about it to connect parameters with each other as a drawing, but probably also as an automated graph. Here's some others, how to sketch the area that's no go in the grade area. Probably is type that should not, that doesn't look nice. So how can you prevent the shapes molding into that? And there are ways of doing that, how to prevent it. At least not to make it really bad. So it's not just the type, it's also designing ways to present it. If you're designing a car and you don't design the test track along with it, or user appreciation surveys, then you can design whatever you want. But it's not, the designer is not the final vote in that. It's not art. So it's my preference, and that's also what I try students to become aware of, that you do the whole thing at the same time, not in a sequential way. You cannot design a testing method if you don't do it at the same time as making the design itself, and the other way around, it also doesn't work. So sketching, my sketchbooks, these are just samples of a whole stack of them. Try to constantly visualize ideas, especially working in a team. You can have great ideas in your head, even if they're really great, but you never know unless they'll get on paper. But to get them on paper and show them to people, talk about it, verify, get feedback is one of the most important things. In my view, in getting through complex design processes. I'll come to the QA later, and I'll try to get this through this first. So trying to the 3 dimensions is is doable. 4 is still a little bit doable, but sketching 10 dimensions, you end up in this kind of graphs, where the problem is that the distance between every 2 circles is the same if you measure that in those high dimensional spaces. So I've been looking into areas how to visualize that and to automate that. So these are some Python output from an existing design space file. You can also use code to read a variable font and then make this kind of animations from it. So it's not all the information is there and it's structured. So you can create programs that query existing fonts and then make graphs that show more what they are, what they contain. So the sketching part of infographics and then publications that contain those infographics in an automated way, because you don't want to do this manually. This is a very, very rudimentary website, variable designer.space. Don't expect anything if you go there, but you can see this thing. So the animations are based on d3.js, which is a JavaScript library that makes it possible to visualize networks, for instance, and you can grab them, you can manipulate them. It's a way of making multiple dimensions. Although on the other hand, if it really gets complex, as you'll see with the next one, it still is very difficult to see what happens. So this is a traditional 27 master design space flattened out into 2 dimensions. That typically is not something you want to visualize. You need to think of simplifying methods to show the differences, different stages and so on. But scripting, you can write code. You can also try to visualize it first and go back and forth. If you can't write it, if you can't draw it, why do you think that writing the code would help you? Trying all those capabilities at the same time. This is about sketches about solving the problem in vertical alignment. That is really a problem between Drawbot, InDesign, Sketch, and CSS. They all do it differently. So how can you make a system that understands vertical alignment and gives the opportunity to designers to choose? So this is the whole overview. You might want to have things aligned on baseline or cap height or descender or x height or half x height or half cap height. And they should be recognized. This is typically things that are missing, for instance, in InDesign, where you want to align top of a headline of a certain point size with the top of a photo, other than do it manually. If you want to automate that, you have to be able to recognize what the positions of those different locations in a typeface are. And those are not fixed values. Depending on the typeface, the position of the cap height and x height can be very different. So sketching, again, how do areas of your code in a library work together? What's the relation between classes? What are they capable of doing? How do they, is a page part of a document, or is it a document just referring to pages? And the pages have no idea from which document they are part of. Those are all decisions if you're writing code that is automating pages and everything down into typography and type. You need to decide how those objects and classes are organized. Testing algorithms. So if you want to know what the point size is for a given width, it's hard to predict. So what you can do is you just guess a point size and see how much of it is different, and then calculate it. Skipping through a lot. This is the digitizing in mid-80s. Earlier than that, sketching the algorithms. I did an internship at URW during my study, and the Icarus algorithm was secret, but I got it from Pitkarov as a present, as a reward for my intern, which is nice. But it's Fortran. It takes a while to understand what this does, going back and forth. At some point I figured it out, so that it became Mac Icarus mid-80s. And understanding how Icarus curves work. This is a processing animation that shows how the five equations in Icarus trying to match up the position of two arcs with each other. Sketching, going back and forth with Gerrit Noordzij about algorithms. This is all even before PostScript, how we're going to draw letters in the future. But late 70s, there weren't even computers, so you have to build them yourself. With, in this case, a printed circuit board that could contain 1K of memory, so that is around 120 letters. Buying a hard drive for 5,000 guilders of 5 megabytes, early 80s, that's one photo. We have around 300 CDs and DVDs over 40 years of the studio, but the first 10 years is on the first CD on board. So we have no idea how much that the speed and volume increased over the years. Half bidding by hand, so it's the pre-version of anti-aliasing, because at that time there was no gray scale that later became more totally automated as we have it now. TROF, which is the typesetting ROF. This is still in your computer, and nobody knows that. But there's a total complete typesetting machine inside the terminal. If you go to your terminal of your Mac and you type manual GROF or TROF, you get this instruction how it works. There are no typesetters that are working with it, and at that time certainly not. So and there was no Unicode. So this is all arbitrary. Every typesetting foundry, typesetting machine manufacturer did it in a different way to figure it out the hard way. And drawing by hand. At that time there were no ways of printing it. This is painted, calculating the diameter of the circle, and then painted in or use markers. And now we have you can do this whole thing in 10 lines of code. It's unfair. And that goes on. So these are more recent ones. Sketching code. How would interpolation show up? What is useful? What is help if you are a designer? And things like algorithms to do automatic spacing and kerning. This is the algorithm that was used for Upgrade. It does 80–90%, which is more or less the same as AIs are doing. So I'm still not sure if that how much of that will actually improve, but probably I'm wrong in the future. And a more recent one. So this is a spacing kerning tool, and within the tool range accessible in the type network. And that is giving feedback and live spacing kerning information, and you can see the groups how they combine. They switch from spacing to kerning, and I don't see that as a sequence. It is the white space between type is not knowing what part came from type from the kerning, what part came from the tracking, what part came from the letter margins. So it probably is better to do it all at the same time instead of spacing and then try to cover up all the mistakes in the spacing later on in the kerning phase. Book by a friend of mine. So he asked, can you do a typeface specifically for this? So it's a book, it's kind of a joke because there's no mountains in Holland. This is about the mountains for bikers or cycling, and of course there are none. Well, there's some small ones, and this is about how famous cyclists did their training. So it started with a flat tire idea of the serif, and then that grew in a typeface with all kind of funny things, with the wheels and gears and of course it's insane to make a typeface for one design job, but if it's fun, it's worthwhile, and it's for a friend. Some other things, a really old one, part of my graduation project at the time, but it became a TypeMedia project. Funny thing of it is that you start with the base shape and you can change the parameters independently, and you can do much easier scripting on that because it's so much more structured than normal typefaces. You don't have to think about optical corrections and overshoot and that kind of things. So it started with manipulating individual parameters, individual pixels, and then the next, when variable fonts came around, you can think about what is a pixel capable of doing in a variable space. So these are studies of 1/4 pixels. So every shape that you see, you have to multiply by 4 and then rotate them to make a complete pixel. And how many points do you need? Because all the masters in a variable font need to interpolate. So the outlines need to contain the same amount of points, and they have to have the same function. But you can put them on top of each other to hide certain features in a certain part of the design space. So this was a study in itself, which I found way more complex than I thought it would be. So how many points do you need to to create a certain set of shapes, and how do you put that in a catalog? How they mold, they morph one shape into another? Is the shapes in between, are they still interesting? And what part of that shape do you want to exclude? Because in this case, because they are creating pixels that are used all over the letter, it doesn't really matter what kind of shape you use, because it still becomes a letter. But at some point there's a limit because you can't recognize the shape anymore. So these are studies, ended up with 11 axes. And then there's a problem, how do you test that? Because 3 dimensions is already insane. 11 dimensions is testing. You end up in hundreds of thousands of combinations that are, you can never test them again. I love to take knowledge and skills from other areas. Simulated annealing is something that comes from industrial design and other testing settings, where you can't say, you can make a complete set of testing values, but by just randomly take positions in that space and see if that still is okay. And then you take 1,000 testing points, and if they are okay, you can assume that every value in between is okay too. That's how cars are tested. You don't test every speed and every circumstances, but you like every temperature or so with 100th of a degree in between. You make some steps, and where you say we tested every 10 degrees, and we tested every 10 kilometers an hour, and everything, if that works, we can interpolate, assume that everything in between also works. So that ends up in this kind of animations where there's a point making a path through random 11 dimensions, and then combine them. And anytime you do it again, it comes up with the fireworks. And so again, as I said before, designing the testing method along with the design is essential, especially if the design becomes more complex. And that can be a variable font of anything more than 5 dimensions, or it can be a corporate identity, or a complex user application. How do you know that you're done? when do you know that this is finished, that it fits the requirements of the original assignment? And the answer is you can't, but at some point you have to deliver. And so part of doing the assignment is designing an environment that you agree with your customer. If it fits those tests, then we consider the assignment to be finished. Otherwise, we try to update that. Some older ones, upgrades already out. You see the spacing tool, printing tool again here. But we're working on some new things, which also starts with sketching. But in this case, the sketching phase is way smaller because this is mostly production work, doing it either manually or script or combinations. Some of the scripts only run once, and then with the result, you make another period of work manually, and then have another script running, and so it's back and forth. The scripting itself is just as much part of the design process as the drawing part is. Another fun project, of course, this is not really commercially interesting, but it's really fun to do. So what's the boldest, blackest typeface you can make, and also be a slab serif, so you have no space for the stems anymore. This is another one which is almost done. This included, if you start from handwriting, what is which you could see as another form of sketching. It's quick, you can do it over again. So what is the transformation? And you can scan it and then trace it, and it often gets into horrible shapes. Or retrace it by making by drawing the hardline. This is more in the direction of metaphon, where we control the shape of and the size of the pen if it runs over this path, and then offer some tools to adjust the shapes and in exceptions. So where the round shapes go into stems, you can make them a little thinner, especially in the bold versions of this. So starting with handwriting as a sketch, transforming it into type. This is an example of the great tool by Joost van Rossum, the font goggles. You can see all the combinations live. Especially with handwriting, you have a lot of feature transformation, glyph replacement, depending on the connectors, the combinations of the type together. An whole other area this is what used to be called icon design, let's say 20 years ago. Nowadays it would be called emoji design. The name changed. For the rest, things didn't change so much, except that we didn't have Unicodes for them at the time. But a lot of the visual grammar comes back here. It's always balanced between coherency and diversity. How much of the icons, how much of it should be the same as with type, to make sure that they belong visually to the same style, and still you need to recognize that they're different and they have a meaning. Problem with icons is that it differs very much if there is a name, a tag, a label with it, explaining what it is about, or you just have to get the meaning from the icon itself. And it's much harder than people think to get this right. Especially it has to be cross-culture, cross-country, cross environment, interests, age groups, making sure everybody understands this and all the same idea, that this is the same word, has the same meaning. It didn't change. Some emojis you might still recognize, but most of them are, you really have to learn them and agree what their meaning is, and probably 10 years from now they have a different meaning. So we've over the years we've been doing a lot of these for applications or for signing systems, or so it has become a whole stack. Sometimes the resolution doesn't matter if this has become going part of a signing system where you have to make symbols and arrows. the resolution is not a problem. Maybe even the ratio is not a problem. If they become part of the top icon in your browser URL, you only have 16 pixels square. You have color and anti-aliasing, but it's still hard to make something that's recognizable. And it's also dangerous. Like, this was a nice idea at first, but then I discovered this week that we already did the COVID-19 icon like 20 years ago. Meaning totally difference of changes when the world changes. Different handwritings, different techniques, depends also on what the resolution is. So if it's going to be 16 square or 32 square, then better start with the thick pencil, not to get lured into adding more lot of details, because they cannot be drawings, they have to be symbols. Another one, and if it's just illustrations, then you have a lot more freedom, especially when the tag. But it's still hard. Like, even if they are symbols, arrows everybody understands, and question marks. But if it gets a little bit more, like you have 9 pixels to visualize different kind of diseases or so, that would be totally impossible. Same for infographics. So it's similar, but it's the wider range of it, where you try to make a visual language which becomes a system. If you see multiple infographics, you understand the consistency in meaning, how certain symbols are reused, and then also design where the variations is. What can be different between one infographic and another, and maybe with some years in between. How can you this, for instance, this was the metaphor for testing water quality in different areas of the country, and you put them in a database, and you see that sequence going from left to right. And we worked on this with several designers, making visuals and illustrations, animations. It was for the computer department of the state department for traffic and environment and water quality and that kind of things. And then another level, like designing the corporate manual, is a design job by itself. Where the infographics are suddenly used to explain people how the corporate identity works. It's not. It's a testing track of a corporate identity. If you cannot make a manual from it, explain to people how it works, how do you think that people can use it later? So that might be also a starting point. Doing it right away at the same time as the corporate identity is made. Why not make the identity of the manual that describes it at the same moment? And anything that has to go into a group, is based on this set of what level of diversity, what level of coherency should there be? So what parameters are you using for what and what for the other? Going to a quick one. For years we designed all the forms for ING Bank and Nationale Nederlanden, which is heavily grid-based. And at that time they had 8,000 different forms in stock, print material, and that had to be designed. So we made a grid system with a ruler like this, and then do a lot of sketching on different types of forms and stationery. How they and is the orange already pre-printed? Then that cannot be part of the changing layout. So then you're stuck with the logo, for instance. But if the orange can be printed, then you have much more freedom. These are sketched at this time. Doing this digital was not really an advantage. I think nowadays we would start with a much more quicker overview of sketching and then pretty quickly go into coding. Except that this whole range of forms no longer exists in physical form. This is all has become HTML and CSS, which is a very different path of design, but at the end, it's still design. So you end up with UX and UI design doing the same thing. So making typographic grid decisions still is worthwhile to spend some time doing it like this. This is a pet project of mine, pretty old. This document is 12 years old, but the idea is much older. So how do you transform automatic page layout into algorithms? And in the beginning, it's easy, like just columns. But this document was more like a testing, it's a benchmark. So it is about automatic page layout, but it is also a complex piece of page layout containing content and illustrations that can be combined and can you make software? I'm still not here. This is still part of the ongoing PagePod project to add in intelligence that understands how different typographic components and illustration components fit together and compose a page, especially if they have different sizes. So you have this rolled up piece of text is called a galley in old-fashioned printmaking, and you cut them and then paste them on the page like just a long run of an article, and you paste them into different columns in film to make the page. This is all pre-digital page layout, but the problem didn't move away. It's just that we more rely on doing it manually in InDesign. But if you want to automate, it's really complex because you have to fit all this. When a headline should go with the text to the next page, although it still fits on the previous page. What do you do with footnotes, and what do you do with a table that's sticking out of the column and it doesn't fit in the next column? And then you have to kind of negotiate between the columns, and software can do that, but it's not a simple thing to, and it's also not something that you can easily solve with artificial intelligence. It needs extra information in how to manipulate this kind of situations and what to do next, designer decisions. A recent project, design education, Xijing Zhang, one former student, organized a trip to Shanghai to make an exhibition in 10 days about design, about type design, and where the whole process of making the exhibition was a design project in itself, with sketching, programming. When Claudia and I both stopped teaching more half-time 3-4 years ago, we decided to start our new school. It's not a master class because we don't have accreditation on master, but it is a master. It's a study on master level, but it can be any length of time. We recently published the new curriculum for the year, starting at 24th of August, from memory, in a variety of different targets. Almost everything that you have seen in this presentation is fitting in one of those workshops. This is a publication we made last year for the typographics goodie bag. Small assignments, keep it small. You can't do the assignment in an hour. Why do you think you can do it in 3 months? That idea. If the architect can only build the whole house for you and not capable of making a sketch or a small model, why would you trust this architect? So making things small and then see if that works and extend from that. So the model in my back is only 10 centimeters high, and it just works just as well as a visual sketch than drawing the whole, building the whole exhibition in real size and then rejecting it. Some covers of the different workshops, you can check them out if you want. So getting back here, sketching is not your sketchbook, that's a medium. The sketching is what you do to visualize for yourself, but especially also for others, people in your team, people that you give an assignment, customers, audience, and what your ideas are, and then get feedback as quick as you can, and then say the next hour, and then do it again and start from scratch if necessary. And so design is a process. It's also learning to play a music instrument and to write a story and to write to raise children and to anything that needs training and developing skills is something that gets better if you do it again. That's not me. That's a whole list of people, including people that are not on this list that over the years worked in or for together in the studio. So many of the things that you saw is their hand. It's not my hand of illustrations, but it's us. So my wife and me, partners in any way, and that was it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you're still there, and I hope it was interesting.